cabin in the storm. This is something I kept to myself for years. It happened when I was in my mid-20s, long before marriage, long before responsibilities took over my life. Back then, I had a different mindset. I craved isolation. I would disappear into the wilderness alone for days at a time, hiking deep into remote forest areas with no signal, no maps downloaded, nothing but basic gear and confidence. Most of my trips were in the Appalachian region. I loved going off-trail, far beyond where casual hikers ever wandered. One trip changed everything. I was 2 days into a solo trek in a remote section of forest land. The weather had been perfect, and I hadn't seen another person since the first morning. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. Then the sky shifted. Dark clouds rolled in fast, the wind grew violent, and the temperature dropped sharply. Within minutes, what looked like simple rain turned into a brutal thunderstorm. Trees were bending, branches snapped overhead, lightning struck somewhere disturbingly close. I was completely exposed on higher ground with a metal-framed pack on my back. Not ideal. So I started searching for shelter. That's when I saw it. Through the trees stood a small, old cabin. It looked abandoned, weathered wood, single window, barely visible from the trail. I didn't hesitate. I ran toward it and pushed the door open. Inside, it was dark, dusty, and smelled terrible. But it was dry. There wasn't much furniture, just a chair, a small table, an old cot frame, and a stone fireplace filled with ash. I dropped my pack, peeled off my soaked layers, and sat on the floor, relieved just to be out of the storm. After I caught my breath, I started looking around more carefully. That's when things felt off. There was a sleeping bag in the corner, not ancient, just old enough to look used. On the table were empty cans and water containers. Someone had been there. Then I noticed the scratches. Near the door were dozens of deep gouges in the wood. At first I thought it was age damage, but they weren't random. They were frantic. I checked the door more closely. There was a metal bracket on the outside for a padlock. Only on the outside. There was no way to lock it from inside. That detail stuck in my mind. I walked to the window next. The glass wasn't broken, which surprised me, until I saw why. Screws had been drilled into the frame from the outside, sealing it shut. On the inside of the window frame were deep scratch marks like someone had tried desperately to pry it open with their bare hands. That's when it hit me. This cabin wasn't just old. Someone had been trapped inside. I should have left immediately, but the storm was raging. Thunder cracked overhead. Rain pounded the roof so loudly it drowned out everything else. I convinced myself whatever happened here was long in the past. So I stayed. Time passed. Maybe an hour? Then I heard it, scraping along the outer wall. At first I blamed the wind, a branch maybe. Then 2 heavy thuds landed on the porch. That wasn't the wind. I froze. I stared at the wall, listening as hard as I could over the storm. I didn't dare look through the window. If someone was outside, they might be staring back. Then came the sound that changed everything. Pressure against the door. Not knocking, not scratching. Someone leaning their full weight against it. The latch rattled once, then stopped. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. And suddenly, something made sense. If someone was outside, why weren't they coming in? The door wasn't locked. Unless they didn't want to come inside. They wanted me inside. That thought snapped me into action. I grabbed my gear and decided I was leaving, storm or not. I had barely finished packing when the window behind me exploded. Glass shattered, something flew through, and in seconds the entire room ignited. Fire spread unnaturally fast, like the walls had been soaked in fuel. Heat slammed into me. I lunged for the door, but it wouldn't move. It was jammed from outside. I threw my shoulder into it with everything I had. The hinges finally gave, and I crashed out into the storm. I ran blindly into the woods. Rain, mud, darkness, none of it mattered. I just needed distance. Then I was tackled from behind. A person, heavy, violent. We fought in the mud. He tried to choke me, clawed at my face. I kicked, scratched, screamed. Somehow I broke free. I didn't look back for long, but I saw the cabin fully engulfed in flames behind the trees. He screamed somewhere in the darkness. I ran until my body quit. I hid under fallen trees for hours, shaking, soaked, barely able to breathe. When I could finally move again, I stumbled through the forest until I found a trail and followed it. Eventually, I reached a trailhead. The next thing I remember clearly is being in a hospital bed. Second-degree burns on my arm and neck. Smoke inhalation. The doctors said I was lucky. Police were told what happened, but in a remote, unmarked section of wilderness, there wasn't much they could do. Someone had set that cabin on fire. In a thunderstorm. It wasn't an accident. After that night, I never went backpacking alone again. My wife thinks I simply became more responsible with age. I never told her the real reason, and I never will. The abandoned fire tower incident. My name isn't important, but this happened about 7 years ago when I was still in my early 20s, back when bad ideas felt like adventures instead of warnings. I had a close friend back then named Ryan. In our group, he was known for one thing: finding places no one else was supposed to be. Abandoned hospitals, empty factories, forgotten train yards. If it was fenced off or off limits, Ryan had already figured out a way inside. He spent hours scrolling through satellite maps and obscure urban exploration forums. Every few weeks, he'd drop screenshots in our group chat with captions like, "We have to check this out." Most of our friends would react with laughing emojis and then never actually go. I was usually the one who said yes. Ryan and I had similar risk tolerance levels, which in hindsight probably wasn't a great thing. Where other people saw danger, we saw a story waiting to happen. One weekend, he messaged me about an old fire lookout tower hidden deep inside a forest a few hours away. According to him, it had been decommissioned decades ago and forgotten. No fences, no patrols, just standing there. His idea? Hike out to it, climb it, and spend the night at the top. I laughed at first. It sounded ridiculous. But the thought of being 70 feet above a forest canopy with nothing but trees in every direction, that part hooked me. We picked a Friday and drove out early in the morning. The hike wasn't on any marked trail. Ryan led the way using coordinates he'd memorized. It was about 4 miles through thick woods, and I honestly expected us to wander in circles and give up. But then we saw it. Through the trees, rising above everything else, was the tower. It looked ancient. Rust crawled up the metal frame. Some lower railings were bent, and there was faded graffiti near the base. The staircase zigzagged upward before turning into a vertical ladder section near the top. It didn't look safe. Ryan didn't hesitate. He started climbing almost immediately. I told him to slow down and check the steps. Some of them wobbled under our weight. A few bolts were heavily corroded. The final vertical ladder section was the worst. Straight up, surrounded by a narrow metal cage that didn't inspire confidence. But somehow, we made it. The view was unbelievable. Trees stretched endlessly in every direction. We had timed it perfectly. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, painting everything orange and gold. We decided to stay the night. There was a narrow wraparound platform outside the small square cabin at the top. We sat there talking as the sky faded from orange to purple to deep blue. Once darkness fully settled, the forest below turned into an endless black void. The stars were the brightest I'd ever seen. But something about the darkness unsettled me. It wasn't just quiet, it felt watchful. Ryan could tell I was getting uneasy, so of course he started joking around. At one point, he smacked his metal water bottle against the railing, sending a loud metallic clang echoing through the forest. The sound carried far, too far. I got genuinely annoyed. The echo felt like a signal flare announcing our location to anything out there. Eventually, I went inside the cabin to lay out my sleeping gear. The inside was mostly empty, stripped of whatever equipment it once held. That's when Ryan called me back outside. His voice was quiet, serious, not joking. He was pointing down into the forest. At first, I couldn't see anything. Then I noticed it. A faint light moving between the trees. It was far away, but clearly visible from our height. It wasn't flickering like a flashlight swinging in someone's hand. It moved smoothly, too smoothly. I whispered that it was probably someone who heard the noise Ryan made. Maybe a ranger, maybe another explorer. Ryan shook his head. "That's not moving like a person," he said. He wasn't wrong. The light drifted evenly, weaving between trees without the natural sway you'd expect. After a few minutes, it became clear it was heading directly toward us. My stomach tightened. We stood there silently, watching it approach. Then something happened that made my blood run cold. The light suddenly jumped forward, not gradually, but like it skipped several yards in an instant. Then it continued moving at the same steady pace as before. I felt sweat building in my palms. Within 10 minutes, the light reached the base of the tower and stopped. It just sat there, directly below us. We couldn't see whoever or whatever was holding it, just the glow. Ryan, being Ryan, yelled down, asking if everything was okay. No response. The light didn't move. He tried again, nothing. Now we were 70 feet up, with our only way down directly above something unknown. We watched that light for what felt like forever. Eventually, I pointed my flashlight down, hoping to reveal someone standing there. But the beam illuminated nothing. The light below remained, but there was no visible source. Then, without warning, it disappeared. Just darkness. Ryan felt relieved. I felt worse. Not being able to see it was far more terrifying than watching it sit there. We retreated inside the cabin, deciding to wait out the night. Neither of us even pretended we were going to sleep. About 20 minutes later, we heard it. A metallic clang echoed up through the tower. Not footsteps, not climbing, more like someone striking the structure with something heavy. A few minutes later, another sound, this time grinding metal against metal. The noises came from different points below, shifting position. Whatever was out there was moving around the tower. We sat frozen, whispering about what we'd do if someone started climbing. Then I saw movement outside one of the windows. A dark silhouette crossed the glass, then past another pane. I yelled before I could stop myself. We rushed to the door and braced ourselves against it, expecting it to burst open. But nothing happened. For the rest of the night, we stayed pressed against that door, barely breathing. When morning finally came, sunlight revealed nothing. No one below, no movement in the trees. We gathered our gear and started descending as quickly as we could. About 3/4 of the way down, Ryan froze. I nearly ran into him. An entire section of the staircase was missing. Not damaged, gone. A full segment of steel steps had been removed. It had to be what we heard during the night, the clanging, the grinding, but that didn't explain the silhouette at the window, or how someone could dismantle steel steps without us clearly hearing it, or how they crossed that gap in the dark. We had no choice but to jump the missing section. It wasn't far, but it was risky. Ryan twisted his ankle landing. I'd barely made it clean. At the base of the tower, there was nothing. No removed steps on the ground, no tools, no footprints, nothing. We left immediately. To this day, neither of us can explain the light that moved too smoothly, the sudden jump forward, the sounds around the tower, the silhouette outside the window, or how a section of staircase vanished overnight. We still talk about it sometimes, and neither of us has ever gone back. The fire that wasn't there. I've been taking solo camping trips for most of my adult life. I started in my early 20s and now I'm pushing 40. After nearly 15 years of hiking alone into remote forests, I'm not reckless. I understand the risks. That's why I always go prepared. I carry enough supplies, emergency gear, and on solo trips, I bring my .308 bolt-action rifle. Not because I expect trouble, but because being alone miles from civilization demands respect for the unknown. This happened 2 years ago in the vast wilderness of Daniel Boone National Forest in eastern Kentucky. If you've never been there, it's enormous, over 700,000 acres of rugged terrain, thick forest, and long stretches where you won't see another human for days. I had just gone through a rough period at work. My head wasn't in a good place. I needed silence, real silence, the kind you only find deep in the woods. I drove out early on a Thursday morning, parked near a trailhead off a Forest Service road, and began hiking. My plan was simple: 3 nights alone in the backcountry. No phone service, no people, just me and the forest. The first day was perfect. I hiked about 7 miles before finding a flat patch near a dry creek bed. I set up my tent, gathered wood, and built a small fire before sunset. I cooked dinner, had a beer, and watched the flames slowly shrink into glowing embers. I hadn't seen a single person all day. I went to sleep feeling calm. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. Nothing dramatic jolted me awake. It was more like my mind suddenly flipped on, the way it sometimes does when you're sleeping somewhere unfamiliar. At first, everything seemed normal. Then I noticed a faint orange glow bleeding through the fabric of my tent. I unzipped the flap slowly and looked out. About 200 yards away, through the trees, I saw it. A fire. Not massive, not out of control, just a steady, flickering flame, like a campfire. I stared at it for several minutes, waiting to hear voices or movement. Nothing, just the quiet crackle in the distance. I considered the possibility of a forest fire, but it wasn't spreading. It looked contained. I assumed it was another camper who had set up nearby after I'd gone to sleep. It wasn't impossible. Maybe they'd turned in and irresponsibly left their fire burning. After watching it for a while longer, I zipped my tent shut and went back to sleep. The next morning, the fire was the first thing on my mind. Not because I was scared, because I was curious. I packed up and hiked toward where I had seen the glow. It took about 10 minutes to reach the area. There was a natural clearing that lined up perfectly with the direction I had seen the fire from. But when I stepped into it, I froze. There was no fire pit, no ashes, no charred wood, no scorched earth, no rocks arranged in a ring. The ground was untouched. I walked the entire clearing, searching carefully. There was absolutely no sign anyone had been there. It looked pristine, like no one had stepped foot in it for months. I stood there confused. I knew what I'd seen. I had watched it flicker for several minutes. Eventually, I convinced myself I must have misjudged the distance or angle. There was nothing else to do but move on. I still had 2 nights planned. That afternoon, I hiked deeper into the forest. The terrain changed as I climbed into older growth. The trees grew taller, the canopy thickened. It became noticeably darker and quieter. I found a new campsite late in the day and settled in. That evening was uneventful. I kept my fire small and put it out early before turning in. Sometime in the night, a violent cracking sound ripped me out of sleep. It was massive, like a thick tree trunk snapping in half. The cracking continued for several seconds before ending in a heavy, ground-shaking thud. I felt it through my sleeping pad. A tree had fallen, I was certain of it. It was terrifying, but also oddly thrilling. Trees don't just fall quietly. It's explosive, chaotic, powerful. But there was no storm, no wind. The night had been still. I lay awake, heart pounding, trying to rationalize it. Dead trees fall sometimes, maybe internal rot, maybe weakened roots.
Then, about 10 minutes later, it happened again. Another explosive crack, louder this time, closer, from a completely different direction. Now I was scared. 2 massive trees falling on a calm, windless night in separate parts of the forest? That didn't sit right. I was still trying to process it when I heard something worse, a low, continuous rumbling sound. It wasn't quite a growl, not exactly a groan. It sounded deliberate, controlled, and it didn't stop. It just went on steadily for what felt like an entire minute. I've spent years outdoors. I've heard bears, elk, coyotes, bobcats. This wasn't anything I recognized. My fear shot through the roof. I grabbed my rifle, chambered around as quietly as I could, and aimed it toward the tent entrance. The sound eventually faded, like whatever was making it had moved away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I packed up immediately, but before leaving, I needed to confirm what I'd heard. I walked toward where the second tree had fallen. It didn't take long to find it. The tree was massive, lying across a slope with broken branches scattered around. It was real. When I examined the stump, my stomach dropped. The break wasn't natural. The wood wasn't splintered the way wind damage looks. It was torn, gouged, ripped apart in long, irregular grooves. Some marks were deep, almost an inch into the wood. The bark around the base had been peeled back in strips. It looked less like a tree that had fallen and more like a tree that had been worked on. I've seen beaver damage. This wasn't clean like that. I've seen woodpecker damage. This was far more aggressive. Something had destroyed that trunk until it gave way. That's when I decided I needed to leave. As I turned to go, something near one of the fallen branches caught my attention. A small cluster of objects on the ground. A blue bandana and a carabiner. They were mine. My chest tightened. I tore open my pack and confirmed they were missing. Something had gone through my gear. Something had been close enough to take items and move them. I didn't think, I just ran. I shoved everything into my bag and moved as fast as I could toward the trailhead. The entire hike back felt wrong, like I was being watched. I kept my rifle in my hands the entire time. When I finally reached my car that afternoon, I drove out of there faster than I ever have in my life. Once I was far enough away, I called the police. I don't think they took me seriously. I'm not sure I would have either. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know my belongings don't move themselves. I still go camping. I refuse to let fear win. But every time I wake up in the middle of the night and hear something in the woods, I think about that fire, the one that was never there, and the trees that didn't fall on their own.